So just by a show of hands, who in here uses dating apps on their mobile device on a regular basis or every now and then? All right. Who's had sex with a complete stranger using a dating app in the past year? Anybody?
Yes.
No?
No.
Come on, there's at least one of you guys. Anyways, so just the basic gist is we ripped open a bunch of dating applications. It wasn't really hard to find some really bad things. So there's a lot of bugs that we've reported out that maybe aren't fixed yet. The things we'll talk about today are things that different groups have either fixed already, or the other scenario is that there's some groups that we reached out to maybe say 2-3 months ago and just didn't bother to respond or fix anything, or it's on their roadmap. So we feel that we could talk about those things. So really quick, I'm Jack Mannino, and I'm this guy.
I'm Abdullah Munawar, stereotype. That's me right there, the one, the token brown dude. Okay, so what we did, we took a look at about 30 dating applications across Android and iOS. We took a look at location data. We took a look at analytics that were being passed back and forth. We took a look at information sharing and anything else we pretty much thought was interesting. We took a look at, some of the applications were really, really popular. The user base was in the millions. Some of the applications were really small, in the thousands. And we are updating Office. Oh. Okay. And so, some of the things we were interested in is what sort of data was being stored on the device from the application. Is it anything sensitive? Was it anything unencrypted, et cetera? We took a look at the phone hardware and how it was interacting with the application. Was the application requesting things that were completely and utterly unreasonable, not really needed at all, but for some weird reason it was requesting. We also took a look at additional applications in addition to the mobile dating application to see how it was interacting, the Twitters, the Facebooks, et cetera, Instagram, all that stuff. Now, we're gonna go, so the old-fashioned way of dating conventionally was you met somebody through school or through some sort of social function, maybe your parents, you got set up on a blind date, maybe even through church or something like that. You went on this date with somebody and you took the time during the date to actually get to know them to decide whether you want to continue to date them. Well, mobile applications, dating applications, that's a huge, huge shortcut. The new way to date. The new way to date is all of these things are predefined. So you get matched up based upon filling out some huge questionnaire, and they have some secret sauce algorithm on the back end, and they match you up. Or you take a look at, you browse through people's profiles, and you say, okay, wow, that person's really good looking. I want to talk to them. Also, based upon shared interests, what we found. So there was some pretty interesting things that we found across these applications. So over 75% of the applications, they contain at least one flaw that allowed us to de-anonymize the user. What that basically means is, while the application itself would not display sensitive information, on the back end, the entire model, the entire user model was being returned. That included things like date of birth, email, GPS cords, everything. And the thing of it is that all this data that we found, we really didn't do too much, to be quite honest. We didn't have to look too far. It's not like we tore apart all these applications and looked line by line at the code. I mean, this was stuff we put a proxy in between, and we saw all this data coming through. It was pretty staggering there. 60% of all the, approximately 60% of all the applications transmitted sensitive data over the internet in plain text. So, credentials, location, as I mentioned before. And it wasn't just the application, the communication between the client and server. It was also third-party analytics and ads. And in a lot of cases, that was unencrypted. It was interesting, we actually saw instances where the ads and analytics were encrypted while the basic application itself was not in the least bit. Approximately 40% of the applications had access control, authentication, or session management issues. So what that means is the session ID was the individual's email address. When we would click send me a hint to remember my password, I would actually get emailed my password. And also, once you log in to the application, you're able to basically change your username to anybody else and take over anybody else's account. Pretty straightforward. Not too difficult to do. So yeah, there's an app for that. We took a look at a whole bunch of different types of applications. We kind of wanted to highlight some of them. Ashley Madison. Yeah, that's for cheating on your significant other, your spouse. It's pretty straightforward. They say over, what, 20 million anonymous members? Anonymous, right. Okay. Common interests, such as STDs. And making new friends. If you're socially awkward, you find it difficult to make new friends, and it's a little bit easier for you to talk with people online. There's applications like this where you can just talk about things, hang out, etc. And there's also kind of weird that a dating app based upon your professional network. So you use your LinkedIn address book to basically find a match. And just like it sounds, sex only. Only for sex. If you're not interested in that, don't use the app. Pretty straightforward. So, so now, who uses these applications? We wanted to kind of profile some of the individuals that we felt were most common users of these applications, some of the interesting stuff that we saw. Pretty straightforward. This individual, I'm running out of time, Jane or John, that is really wanting to get married yesterday, not too concerned about what sort of information he or she's putting out there, just wants to be married or be in a relationship, doesn't care the least bit. We've got Mr. Anthony Weiner. For any of you know, when we did all this R&D, my alias was Carlos Danger. I did all of that under him. So, powerful, wealthy, probably married, maybe has kids, but definitely wants a side piece. So, this individual definitely trusts the applications, the developers of these applications, to keep their identity hidden. They believe, oh yeah, all the stuff that they advertise, the military-grade encryption that everybody says they have, it works. I'm not going to be found out. And then, of course, we have Buffalo Bill. There is a chance that when you're talking to people through these mobile dating apps, especially you're using the location services, et cetera, you could have Buffalo Bill on the other end, and nobody wants to end up in his basement putting on lotion. We wanted to highlight some of this stuff to kind of show you guys some of the things that are coming out. So this is, I believe, the eHarmony acceptable use policy. It states, the gist of it is basically that we don't conduct any sort of criminal background screenings. However, we reserve the right to, but we really don't at all. This is a joint statement from the state of California partnering up with, I believe it's eHarmony, Match, and Spark Networks to try and create some sort of standard and goodwill amongst the mobile dating app in the dating app community to say, hey, let's put ourselves to a certain standard. Let's try and help keep these users' privacy and prevent people who have background, criminal records, et cetera, out of these applications. However, it's, as you can kind of see, even within it, they state, yeah, it's kind of hard to do this, so if we can do it, great. If not, not a big deal. And the other interesting thing here is that they don't really want these dating applications to advertise that they have any sort of sex offender, sex tracking type tools, because they don't want to make false claims to kind of fool the users into thinking there's some sort of false sense of security there. All right, and Jack is going to talk about de-anonymizing.
All right. Yeah, so this is one of the more fun things we got to look at. So the information that you put out there, it's pretty interesting because you can piece together lots of different things to kind of figure out who somebody is. So if you have somebody's birth date and you have maybe their zip code, maybe you can't figure out that maybe there's two people with that same birth date, but you can narrow it down to maybe one or two people. So we found, just an obscene amount of this stuff out there. And we didn't really see many, we compared the small apps to the big apps. And we really didn't see any consistency, like the big guys got it right and the small guys got it wrong. It was kind of like the big guys were equally as screwed up as the small guys in most cases. With the exception of actually stripping like EXIF data off of images. So Facebook, Twitter, they do it really well. The bigger apps like Tinder, Plenty of Fish, they do a good job of that. But the smaller apps, yeah, that stuff's all there in the images to basically rip out of that. So location services. So the interesting thing is that we're giving this stuff away. These applications suck if we're not giving that away. The whole appeal is finding people around you with similar interests. So if you're not advertising that information and vice versa, you're probably not going to connect with those people. Next one. So we ran into really three different scenarios when it comes to location. The first one is some apps just blatantly give away your exact GPS coordinates. There's some applications that'll return the distance, but not necessarily the GPS coordinates themselves. But assuming, which we'll show an example of it, if you can continue to change your location, you can sort of triangulate where that person is, as long as you have the distance and as long as there's some reasonable degree of precision that you get back. The other thing we saw, there were some apps, there's actually a quote patenting algorithm that basically does shit. Which lets you basically shift your location, but of course, if you shift the location, you still get the distance, and you can do things, and basically you can still narrow it down to a reasonable range. We didn't really find any of those things to be really that effective. Basically, what we saw was probably the most effective was, you really can't get it perfect, but we'll talk about it a little more, but you basically spread the distance out. From a couple feet, that's a bad idea. If you go to like a mile, 2 miles, kilometers, it's a little more reasonable. So here's an example of an application. Sorry, it went off the side. Yeah. So you can see this one, for example. They just basically return the entire user model. So this is really common in like MVC type applications. So if anyone does it, model view controller type applications. So in this example, this is just basically like the whole user model. So it may be mapped to like say a table, the user table. And it's all the different columns, all the information in there. So all the MVC frameworks make it pretty easy to take like a model and map it to, say JSON array. And that's exactly what they do. So like, Rails are seeing like a 2JSON. Spring, you have like Jackson to do that stuff. And all the MVC frameworks like support that. And this is just an example of something, and most developers don't realize they're even doing that, to be perfectly honest. Because what they're doing is they're pick and choosing pieces of that they're actually displaying in the UI. But beyond that, they discard the rest of it. So like if they would run it through a proxy, they'd be like, well, shit, there's GPS coords in there. But usually developers don't get around to that.
It's drama, by the way.
Yeah, which those guys are actually fixing that. So here's an example of distance we talked about. So they're not actually giving away the GPS coords. But you can see, so they have the distance, and there's a lot of decimals behind that, which translates to a much smaller range where they could possibly be. So again, if you have that much precision in their distance, you could probably find where that person is. So yeah, Tinder had this problem a while back. They fixed it. There may be still some ways around that, but they fixed it from what I understand. But essentially, yeah. Next one. Actually, go back. Sorry. Back. Yeah. Sorry, I screwed that one up. So really, there's some things they can do to kind of make it a little bit better, but then there's also some things that are just perfectly honest impossible to fix. For example, if I'm in Romania and then I'm in the US like 2 seconds later, unless you can teleport, you're probably not going to be able to do that realistically. So most of the applications we check, they don't really flag that kind of weird behavior. They just allow it. Didn't really see anybody rate limiting how often you could shift your location, which that makes it just that much easier to actually pull these types of things off. So even if you put those things in place and say you limit the users to doing it, I don't know, once, twice, 3 times an hour, just create more accounts. And if you have 20, 30 accounts, you can continue to do the same types of things. So it's not that easy, but I mean, the best way to do it is to basically spread out the distance and don't return like 10 decimals, of precision to where the person actually is. Yes. So just a couple examples of things that we saw, similar to the location. The root cause in most cases was pretty much the same thing, where they just blindly returned everything in the user model. Yes. So here's an example of birth date. So this is Scout. They didn't respond to us, so you can see pretty much there's the person's birth date. Profiles, you could also get that person's name. You know exactly where they're at. So I mean, there's a million different ways you could use this thing called the internet to actually look that information up. And you can usually figure out who that person is. Here's another gem where they give you everybody's email addresses. So I mean, if you want to know if your spouse is cheating on you, assuming you're semi-technical, you could actually basically bang through the entire range of accounts that are on there and pull back their email addresses. So, yeah, not saying that we saw any examples of one on the top, but if you're doing that, you probably shouldn't do that. And to be honest, if being anonymous is your number one concern, you probably shouldn't be using your own email address, your cell phone number. There's some applications that allow you to log in, say like cell phone number, for example. And that also works with the forgot password. So if you type that in and it says, oh, we sent an email, well, your spouse might know that you registered with your phone to do that. So yeah, if you're trying to be anonymous, I would just say don't give much of your own information away. So social networks. So most of the applications we looked at allowed you, so there's the ones that they map to your social graph, and there's some power in that because instead of just meeting people that you have nothing in common with, they take all the information that Facebook harvests about you, and they can tap into that. So I mean there is some power in that for sure, but I guess the problem with that is assuming like something like Ashley Madison type of application. You might not want people to be able to go back to your Facebook profile and see pictures of you and your wife and maybe friend your wife on Facebook or your kids or your mother. So yeah, 9 times out of 10 if you're doing that kind of stuff, you're probably not the same person in both lives. Like let's be honest here. We did find examples where the applications were leaking some of that stuff back. So your Facebook ID, your Google Plus ID, your Twitter ID. I mean, if you're using your LinkedIn ID to do this kind of stuff, then I guess you kind of deserve what's coming to you at that point. But yeah, we did find that a lot of these applications were actually allowing you to basically go from here's this guy wearing a mask to here's this guy holding his baby, which is a bad thing. All right.
Yeah. So yeah, broken authentication is definitely broken. None of the applications we looked at really supported any sort of multi-factor authentication. Nowadays, it's pretty straightforward, not too complicated for the developers out there to implement something like this. So we really didn't find any of it, except with one somewhat exception. The only one app we looked at that provided a somewhat of an on-device pass lock was the Ashley Madison Black Book. This application is pretty interesting. What it does is it's somewhat of a container that provides like a burner cell phone number with self-contained SMS capabilities, and it's accessed via this 4-digit passcode. And so it's different from your regular cell phone number, and the communication is supposed to be self-contained within the application. It also stores your black book in the application itself. However,
Yes.
hold
that thought.
excellent question.
Yeah.
Well, I'll get to that in a second. Go ahead. There's some problems with it, definitely, right? There's no protection against brute force attacks. So this 4-digit combination, your significant other can just sit there and hammer away on it until they crack it. There is no, hey, after X amount of invalid attempts, we wipe the container with all this information to kind of keep you secure there. There's absolutely nothing like that. Also, looking at the code a little, you can see up there at the top, the key is a symmetric key. And so that means that it's used for both encryption and decryption. It's 16 zeros, which means that you can basically crack the encryption within the application. Also, the username and password for the application are stored in plain text, stored locally within the application. So yeah, so some problems there with this app. And so we kind of wanted to throw this out to the audience. Who can spot the problem with this? And I think they're going to win a prize. Who can spot the problem? Anybody?
So that's for actually sending or accessing someone's messages. So it's a RESTful request. That's true, but there's another issue with that. Yes.
Exactly. Who was that? There you go. Somebody down there. You gonna get one whether you like it or not? Just kidding. Okay.
All right. So I guess we'll talk a little bit about, yeah, by the way, that last class of bugs, there's some really nasty ones out there, so go find them on your own. Next slide. So SSL, I mean, this is, a basic thing. But yeah, we found more than half the application. So this is Christian Mingle. So, we did the Internet Good Samaritan thing. I mean, we sent a bunch of bugs out. And this was their answer. I don't know how well you can see that in the back, but I'll read it. It says, thank you for your inquiry. So we wrote to them, said, hey, you don't encrypt like anything. Your web app and your mobile app, maybe you guys want to do that at some point. Thank you for your inquiry. We take security seriously here. Our system encrypts sensitive information before it's sent over the internet, protecting our members' personal information. That's great, except they don't actually encrypt it when it's sent over the internet. So everything is in the plane, from your credentials to maybe financial stuff, to session tokens, your conversations, so on and so forth. So yeah, just here's an example. I mean, it's plain as day, just absolutely no encryption. Next one. This one was from the Positive Singles. This is the STD dating app. Example, another one where, so depending on who you are, if you're, running out of time Jane up there that we talked about before, maybe it's not as big of a deal, but if you're Anthony Weiner and somebody can sniff that data, that's a big deal. That's a bad day in your life. Next one. And yeah, here was Scout. This is another really big app, and they don't care either. So the other stuff we ran into, and again, these problems aren't specific to dating apps. These are prevalent issues, I guess, in mobile apps everywhere. But just given the type of data that you're sending back and forth with these types of things, the intimate conversations, it kind of puts a different twist on things. So for certificate issues, so the apps that actually did attempt SSL, so certificate pinning, it's a great thing. I'd say I venture to say maybe less than 1% of apps actually pin certificates. So like a couple months back, they made a big deal out of the WhatsApp application that they didn't pin certificates, but I mean, nobody's pinning certificates. Facebook does it, Twitter does it, maybe some financials, but it's still a small part of the population that actually does certificate pinning. So here's just an example of code that's actually taken from an OWASP project. So basically, you provide the public key. You don't really care about the CAs in between. If the right private key is on the other side, then you talk to each other. And it just kind of removes some things from that whole process. But yeah, I mean, 0% of those applications were doing it. Like not a single application was attempting to pin a certificate. They should probably do it. It's a good thing to do. Some apps also take the liberty of turning off SSL checks for certificate issues. So here's another one, and this was from the JAMO app, and they're fixing that one. So can anybody tell me what the problem is with that? So what this is the SSL code. So they've implemented their own logic outside of what the standard HTTP client library provides. What's happening there? Can anybody tell me? Exactly, right. So what happens there is that somebody is in position to man in the middle of you. So it could be intelligence. It could be your spouse that thinks you're up to no good. And yeah, they just pretty much turn off all the checks there. So each one of those methods basically doesn't throw anything. So if it was actually in a normal world, where if they weren't doing that, either the connection's going to fail and it's going to throw an exception, but the point is you're not sending data back and forth. So in this scenario, it's pretty much completely transparent to the end user that that's actually happening to them. So we talked a lot about the applications themselves. So I mean, as an app developer, you have the ability to control these things, encrypt communications, do the right thing with certificate errors, and so on and so forth. But what most developers kind of drop the ball on is when they start dropping in like third-party libraries. So analytics, ad networks. So pretty much when they're using ad networks, their goal is to make money, like support the application and monetize them by serving you, obnoxious ads about stuff you never want to buy. So really have to be careful with some of these. Definitely some privacy concerns. In this example here, they're sending you GPS cords. Plain text. So imagine the rest of the application's doing it right. They're just shuttling this stuff off. So a lot of times, to be perfectly honest, like the developers don't really pay attention to that. They'll enable permissions in the application that maybe only the ad network needs, that their application not actually leverage it, but they'll try to run it, and they'll be like, oh, I'm getting this exception, security exception. This permission's not there. So they'll just start dropping permissions in just so they can use these networks. So the reason the ad networks go to the next one. In this example here, so they're actually sending you MAC address. So whereas in a browser, you can have a tracking cookie and possibly track across different sites. It's a little harder on iOS and Android because there is some sandboxing. So for example, if you were to drop that into like a SQLite database on the app, in theory, only the app should actually be able to read that data. So the ad networks have resorted to other things where they're actually, instead of like dropping that on there, they're actually trying to like identify you based on the device. So they can track you between applications on the ad networks. So one of the things they can track you with is MAC addresses. They can use device IDs as another popular way of doing it. But just the point is the stuff is just getting sent out there, and most developers don't know that's actually happening. Here's another good one. So as soon as you sign up for this one application, it goes on to tell Google what your sexual preference is. So it didn't actually follow up to seeing like if you would change that, if the ads you would get would actually change afterwards based on that. I don't know, that's a pet project if somebody wants to do that. Let me know how that works out. But yeah, they're sending your sexual preference out. So, I mean, if you're putting it out there, and to be honest, like Google probably knows this anyway, and it's a moot point, right? But in any event, yeah, that could potentially piss some people off.
Okay. So, doing it the right way. If you're a developer, really, don't be a dick. Don't opt your users into things that they're going to hate you for. that they're going to get spammed with, their email address, their personal information is going to go out. Just don't do it. It's not nice.
You would be amazed, though, by the way, at how many of the applications actually do auto-opt you into sharing your location, sharing stuff like your birth date. I mean, if you're using any of these applications, like before you do much on them, go into your settings. I mean, if the application actually has like a web-enabled version and a mobile version, do it on the web version. So the interesting thing we also caught in some of the apps that have a mobile version and a web version is that they actually return different information from the API versus like the conventional forms-based kind of web application. And we think the root cause of that is like, just like we said, we're just basically mapping and returning like the whole model from an API versus in the forms-based application, they may just take bits and pieces of it and add a variable to return. Moral of the story is like we found huge discrepancies between the web and mobile versions of what they return. So if you can do it and first using it, register through the web application, turn off everything you can, and then have fun. Hope for the best.
Pay attention to what you expose. So Jack talked about it earlier. To typically use an email address that's not your primary email address. May not want to put your real date of birth out there. Make sure that the applications you're looking at are not really pinpointing your location. Anything else? And lastly, be selective of your friends. Nobody wants to end up in Buffalo Bill's basement, so be careful. I mean, you're talking to people, a lot of these applications are location-based, so the whole point of it is to inevitably meet up. May want to meet up in a public place, things like that. And that's it.
That's the end, folks.
That's our contact information in case anybody wants to contact us, email and Twitter.
If anybody wants to hook up on Tinder, just let me know.